that to couple with Bob Marley music, I asked the temperature to be turned up, so we felt like we were on the beach. I heard it was a little cooler in here yesterday, and I'm jealous. I like to be cold. I'm the coordinator of football officials for the Sun Belt Conference, a part of a football officiating program that includes 3 overall conferences, the SEC and the Southern Conference, along with the Sun Belt. It's great to be with you here today. It's always exciting to be a part of the preseason. Everyone seems to be happy in the preseason. Everyone's undefeated. No one's incurred any in-season injuries yet, and the officiating department hasn't created any controversy, which I know makes me a fairly bland topic. You guys seem to be much more interested in getting some words out of me when something goes sideways on the field on Saturdays. But nonetheless, I'm happy to be here in New Orleans and being a part of the Sun Belt Media Days that kick off to their 2022 football season. I basically bring 2 things to you today. I have using statistics for the FBS football level, a recap of the 21 season, statistic recap of the 21 season, and showing you where the Sun Belt fits into those statistics. And then I have something on new rules, including some video to illustrate the new playing rules that we have. So with that, let's get into it. The first statistic is just overall game time, and you can see this is relatively flat. There is, from all conversations that I have with stakeholders of college football, no one's concerned with the overall game time. Our television partners are not concerned with it. By the viewing numbers that we get from our football games, the viewers, the fans don't seem to be concerned with it. This is a fairly good place, and it's flat. Let me compare, by the way, the Sun Belt average game time for Sun Belt games last year was just a single minute below the 3:18 average for all of FBS. Let me show you the overall game time against some other statistics. The first is scoring. You're going to see here that there's a fairly good dependency between these two. One goes up, the other goes up, one goes down, the other goes down. Scoring was slightly down to 55.1 points per game across all of FBS, and the Sun Belt was right there at 54.2. When we look at scoring, we think of the playing rules and the competitive balance it creates between offense and defense. And again, from what I hear from the stakeholders of the game, where we are with scoring, not wildly going up and down, or maybe more importantly, not on a fairly steep trend going up. It tells us that the balance between the offense and defense that the playing rules creates is in a good place. Let's show game time against plays per game. This is something that is being paid attention to much more than just overall game time. Number of plays per game at the FBS level is at 180.3. You can see it's fairly flat, but what's happening, and it's not illustrated here, is if I look at the dispersion of number of plays per game against all the games played in the Sun Belt for 2021, or all of the games played in FBS in 2021, it's a bell curve. It's a fairly uniform bell curve, but it's getting flat. And each side of the bell is getting further and further away from the center, meaning our outlier games, the games that have the most number of plays, the games that have the least number of plays, they're getting further and further from the median. I'll give you 2 statistics that are somewhat eye-opening. In all of FBS last year, the greatest number of plays in a game happened twice. 229 plays were played in 2 FBS games here. My recollection is one in the ACC and one in the Big 12. The lowest amount of plays in a game last year at FBS was 127. I believe that game was played in the Big 12. So there's a variance of 80% between the least amount of plays in a game and the greatest number of plays in a game. There's not many things we look at statistically that has a variance of 80%. And when you get games that are up in the 215, 220 and above, that's cause for concern. Here's another statistic that really puts this in, I believe, shows how college football is changing. There's a statistic that's created, I don't have it unfortunately today, but there's a statistic that's created of how fast offenses go from a tempo standpoint. And the statistic is simply the number of offensive plays that you run divided by the amount of playing time that's in a game, 60 minutes. The fastest, in 2021, the fastest NFL offense would have been 74th in NCAA. There's 73 college teams last year that ran more offensive plays per unit of game time than the fastest offense in the NFL. The games are different in that respect. And this number of plays per game is something that the stakeholders are watching. Sunbelt was 175.8 plays per game, a good five plays below the 180. I don't necessarily have any explanation for the causality of that. Some offenses are more purposeful. Replay stops per game. This is probably one of the more statistically significant, of anything I'm presenting here statistic-wise, one of the more significant. Last year I was talking about how we were up at 2.5 and we have a trend going up. And I have a chart coming up that shows the trend over a 10-year time frame. And I was saying, you know what, if we continue on this trend, we maybe are going to get to a place that college football doesn't necessarily want to be. Well, lo and behold, in 2021, we only had 2.2 stops per game. It went down 12%. I believe that's 12% reduction. I don't necessarily know, have an explanation for that, except for one possible variable that I think is there's a dependency between the two, and I'll cover that on a slide coming up. We had 2.4 stops per game in the Sun Belt. And this causality that I'm going to have on a slide coming up, I think explains why the Sun Belt was 0.2 stops above the national average. Something this low, between 2 and 2.5, the stakeholders of the game are comfortable with that. If we got over 3, I would think we would start thinking about, is this what we want for our game? This shows the number of fouls per game across all of FBS. You can see two things here. The number of fouls per game is fairly flat, about as flat as it can be. And the game time there's not a strong dependency between game time and the number of fouls per game. In other words, if you were looking at overall game time, trying to solve for why is a game taking 3:18 on average in 2021, how can we make it faster? Fouls per game doesn't necessarily look like it's going to help you solve or answer those questions. 13.1 were the number of fouls that we had per game in 2021 in the Sun Belt Conference, and I have a little bit more expanded information on this in a bit. This shows targeting per game, number of targeting calls confirmed per game across FBS. Targeting is the #1 safety issue in our game, and it has been for quite a long time now. And I imagine it will remain #1 for quite a long time in the future. And anytime it goes down, particularly 0.27 down to, it's occurring once every 5 games at 0.2. That's good news that it's going down. In the Sun Belt, we had 3.3 per game. That's eye-opening. And if you go back to the fact that we had 2.4 replay stops per game against the national average of 0.2, this is the causality. Every targeting call is an automatic replay stop for the game. So if you have more targeting per game, your number of replay stops are going to go up in the game. So I think the fact that we were above the national average, FBS average on stops per game is related, fairly strong relation to the fact that we're this much higher in a number of targetings per game. I talked about I had a 10-year trend on replay stops and the amount of review time. Let's talk about the blue line. That's the replay stops. You can see from 2011 to 2020, we had a 67% increase in the number of stops per game from 1.5 to 2.5. And last year at this time, I was talking to various individuals and groups about how if we continued 67% growth trend over the next 10 years, we're going to be stopping the game at just over 4 times per game. And that means that for every time you have 1 or 2 stops per game, that you're going to have a game that has 6 or 7 stops per game. That's probably would cause concern for the stakeholders of the game. But we did have this statistically significant drop down to 2.2, and I don't know that it caused a lot of, or generated a lot of conversation during the Rules Committee meetings this past winter in Indianapolis. As far as review times, it's fairly flat. You see over the last 11 years, the high was in 2020 at a minute 28. The low was a 114 in 2013. Our replay group, we focus on two things that are above our average replay review time. We're looking to get to, every time we stop the game, we get to 100% correct outcomes. We didn't get there last year. In the Sun Belt, we had 4 incorrect outcomes against, I believe it was 90-some replay stops. We want to get perfect. We want that to be 0. The second thing that we monitor for replay performance is we don't have any missed stops. Those would be plays where there is video evidence that shows that the ruling on the field should be looked at and we just don't get the game stopped. High-tempo offense has put a challenge on us in this area and it doesn't give us time to get 2 or 3 quality reviews of 2 or 3 different camera angles before the ball is next stop. We want that to be 0%. We don't want to have any missed stops. I believe we had 5 missed stops in the Sun Belt last year. When we get to 100% correct outcomes and we get to 0% missed stops, then I'll start worrying about average review times, right? Trying to shave 3 or 4 or 8 seconds off average review times, to me, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we're not at 100% correct outcomes every time we stop the game and we don't get our missed stops down to 0%. We, not all being said, we were below a minute in average review time in the Sun Belt, which is excellent. Absolutely excellent. But we're only going to take as much credit for that as we reach our goals of 100% correct outcomes and 0% missed stops. Here shows just the number of fouls per game that we're throwing in the Sun Belt against the FBS average for the last 5 years. Doesn't necessarily tell us a lot other than we're not an outlier, right? We're not statistically different or off of where the national average is. And we look at it in 2021, here's the Sun Belt with its 13.1 fouls per game. Here's the other group of 5 conferences that are put up there. We had the least amount of fouls per game against our group of 5 peers. And then if I throw up the 5 autonomy 5 conferences, it shows you we were the second lowest fouls per game in all of FBS last year. I mentioned that our football officiating program that I lead also has the Southeastern Conference. The Southeastern Conference is this autonomy 5 bar that has 14.3 per game. 14.3 is the median for all of the conferences last year in 2021. Very comfortable where we are in this regard. So that's it. Just a recap of last season, both at the FBS level and how the Sun Belt compares against FBS using statistics. I'm going to move on to the second part of my presentation, talking about new playing rules. Can regularly be a fairly dry topic, but we do have a significant rule change this year that's about as significant of a change that we've had in about 3 or 4. And it has to do with blocking below the waist. This has happened multiple times over the last 25 to 30 years, where the caretakers of the game in the goal of safety, student-athlete safety, have changed the blocking below the waist, and every time it's changed, it becomes more restricted. And here we are in 2022, and that's exactly what happens. When you can legally block below the waist has become more restrictive. This is a tackle box. Its definition hasn't changed. The tackle box isn't strictly tackle to tackle, and I have a video play that I'll show you that explains why it's not strictly that definition. It's rather 5 yards laterally from where the ball is snapped. And it almost always is tackle to tackle. There are exceptions, but it's almost always tackle to tackle. The rules now state that you need to be, if you have any chance, any ability to legally block below the waist, you need to be stationary in the tackle box at the snap. If you're not stationary, or you're stationary but outside of the tackle box, you can no longer, under any circumstance, legally block below the waist. Quarterbacks and running backs almost always are stationary at the snap in the box. Wingbacks, sometimes called halfbacks, if they shade a part of the nearest lineman that is in the tackle box. And by shading, if they have some body part that overlaps the body part of the tackle, typically it's the tackle that's in front of them, they are considered in the tackle box. And as long as they're not in motion and snap, they're considered stationary. They can block legally below the waist, although they do have some additional requirements, and I'll get that in a second. Tight ends can no longer block below the waist under any circumstance. This is a major change from last year. This will affect how offensive football is coached and how offensive football needs to be executed on the field from previous years. A wingback that doesn't get any piece of that tackle, or a halfback if you want to call him that, even if he's stationary, he cannot block below the waist under any circumstance. Wide receivers, in no circumstance, can legally block below the waist. Anyone in motion, whether they're in the tackle box or not at the snap, cannot block below the waist. So let's talk about, I said that there's additional restrictions in some circumstances. Even if you're stationary in the box, you may have additional requirements. Let's talk about them. For what we usually refer to as our interior linemen. These are players that are on the line of scrimmage in the tackle box. They can block below the waist against an opponent up to a yard in the defensive backfield. And on their initial line charge, they can block not directed from the front. They can get them from the side, and as long as it's above the knee, they can get them at the back of the thigh. On their initial line charge, these 5 players only do not have to get directed from the front, sometimes referred to as 10 to 2. They can get them from the side, they can get them above the knee from behind. Only on initial line charge. Anyone else that can legally block below the waist has to get directed from the front 10 to 2. So if I have a pulling guard, when he pulls, no longer considered initial line surge, he can block an opponent while the ball is still low, while the ball is still in the tackle box, the block is in the tackle box, and he's got to get directed from the front. If the player that his blocking assignment